Hello there sexy PlayStation gamers, and welcome back to another pure PlayStation video review. And yes, it's the big one, The Last of Us 2, or The Last of Us Part 2, on PS4. The Last of Us 2 is not a fun game. It's miserable, morbid, and excessively violent. But so was the first game that originally released back in 2013 on the PS3. But I definitely enjoyed that one a lot more than what was being presented to me now in 2020. Fair warning, there will be some spoilers going forward, but nothing that hasn't already been spoiled on social media anyway. If you want to go into The Last of Us 2 completely clean, I recommend you go ahead and play the game, then come back and see if we share similar views. But please don't just look for the score and then play the game with a number stuck in your head. It's not good for you. So again, this is your last warning, there will be spoilers, like proper spoilers. I'm naming names and I'm throwing shade, and discussing some plot points. I've tried several versions of this where I've not used names and I've remained super vague, but it's a mess and it doesn't do me any favours in trying to get my review across in the right way to you. So, where to begin? There's a lot of facts to cut through, so let's start with the story, as it's the real reason I wanted in on the game in the first place. The story is, in 2 words, hot garbage. It's awful, absolute tosh, but unlike the incels on Twitter, I'll do a fair job of telling you exactly why I think that. So first we have to go back to the first game. The original game wasn't all that original, but it did a good job all the same. Joel, a gruff fella who has taken a dislike to life after his daughter is killed and the pandemic takes over the world, takes on a young girl who he really dislikes, but over the course of the game he bonds with her and they become almost like family. Joel does some terrible, awful things to keep Ellie safe, and I, as the player, I held some respect for Joel. I also had some respect for the story, despite it cribbing hard from movies. It was basically The Road, but with zombies and more action. But it felt grounded, and I could understand the motivations of everyone involved, for the most part. The Last of Us was a sad dad movie game, and that's fine. I got it, I liked it, and I enjoyed it. I rooted for Joel and Ellie every step of the way. It was the same with The Last of Us 2, up until a certain point. Early on in the game, Ellie is devastated through the loss of a loved one. The killer, Abby, acts in cold blood. For the first dozen hours or so, we take Ellie on a revenge mission. She wants blood, all of it. If she could, she'd be drinking it from Abby's skull. She's that pissed. This is where the violence comes in, and it's central to the overall themes to the game. Violence and the cycle of it. The consequences to one's actions, and the addiction. Ellie is laser focused on getting to Abby, no matter the cost. She'll bring her friends along and put them in danger, just for the chance to cut Abby's throat. The game's dialogue and narrative arc are all pushing that violence either is or isn't the answer, but it never really seems to pick a side, instead erring in the middle under the pretense of being mature, cinematic, and somehow profound in its bold use of violence. Unfortunately for me, it fails at every step. As the player, I'm expected to sit and judge Ellie's actions. Now, there are a few scenes where Ellie does some really fucked up shit, and one scene in particular had me questioning if it was time to put the controller down, eject the disc, and call it a loss. I didn't, obviously, but the scene kept fluttering around in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the writers and the game's director wanted me to feel one thing, but I ended up feeling another. And being expected to judge Ellie's actions is ridiculous. This is a video game. This isn't the same as a movie, no matter how much Dr. Uckman wishes it were. I already discussed this with my pure PlayStation colleagues throughout my playthrough, and it reminded me of the recent-ish Bruce Willis movie where he goes on a revenge mission in his town, killing without remorse, torturing, maiming, and generally being a bad mother hugger. The aim of the movie was to show what can happen when a man breaks and finds no help via the proper channels, and to get us looking inward and then outward to judge Brucey's murder-death-kill spree. It's easy to do with a movie. You're a passive observer without a hand in what's happening. Everything's predetermined, and you know that your job as a viewer is to judge those on screen for their actions, and sometimes they're terrible performances. Anybody see Bruce Willis in Trauma Center? Oh my god. In a video game, this just doesn't work. How can I sit and think about what an awful person Ellie is for doing what she does when I'm the one holding the controller, pressing the buttons, and cheering at blowing a man's face off with a shotgun? I can't. No bloody way. Then the game pulls a massive bait and switch at around the halfway mark. Just when I thought the game was done, it wasn't. I was then thrust into the boots of the burly Abby for another 10 to 12 hours, and this was coming off a rare climatic cutscene that should have pushed the story to its next big beat. The cutscenes aren't rare, by the way, but the ones that actually do anything, well, they are, but more on that later. This pissed me off to no end. I'd already had to endure over a dozen cringe-worthy cutscenes and annoying flashback sequences, and now I was being made to wait an undeterminable amount of time to get the big payoff. No, piss off. It was here that I had another moment that had me wondering if it was time to call it a day and move on to SpongeBob SquarePants. Again, I didn't, obviously, but going forward into the second half of the game, I was really annoyed at the lack of respect for the player. All of that just to shit it away and make me play as the character that Ellie hates, that I also hate? Why? Well, it's to connect you to this cold-hearted killer, obviously. It's as if the writers were setting themselves the challenge of creating a character that would be so universally hated, and then to see if they could win players back and make them like this character. It feels more like an experiment than anything else, and you know what? It didn't work. Not for me, at least. To use the words Ellie did, she's a fucking cunt. Abby did something horrible, and I've been Team Ellie since before Abby was a concept drawing on a scrap of paper. That was never going to change. This was a massive misstep from Naughty Dog, and for me, it ruined the entire experience. From that moment on, I just wanted the game to end. I'd already seen the ending coming, because if The Last of Us 2 is anything, it's predictable. I had the same problem with the first game where I kind of had the ending in my head at around the halfway mark. But I still enjoyed it for what it was, because I wanted to see if I was right. And not to brag, but yeah, I was spot on the first time round. Go me! This time though, I didn't care if I was right or wrong. I just wanted the credits to roll so I could get this review over and done with, and then move on to something a little more cheery and a little less full of itself. Now, I could go into a lot more detail on the story's shortcomings, the Swiss cheese plot holes and characters, but I'll leave it there. One last thing I will say is that the use of flashbacks was a fucking disastrous decision. Every time the story hit a peak, it came tumbling down the cliffside, landing squarely into a flashback, the majority of which were pointless padding, filled with uncomfortable dialogue and not much to do. Most could have worked as cutscenes, or literally, could have just been cutscenes that never saw the light of day. To put it simply, I found the story to be long as a river, shallow as a bath. There are some points in the story that are genuinely amazing, but the insistence on putting me through some harrowing ordeals during the gameplay just to bring everything to a grinding halt so we can get a bit more exposition, fancy camera angles and some very awkward scenes, including a sex scene that really had no purpose other than to show a bit of titty and get a bit of shock value in. And don't even get me started on the ending. Right, so far we've had about 8 minutes of the game's abysmal story, and it's time to move on. Let's talk about gameplay, because at least I have some good things to say about that. I really enjoyed the gameplay, for the most part. It's similar to what we already know from the first game, sneaking around, collecting bits of crap to craft into bits of kit that can help you survive, killing bad guys and doing some light puzzles. That's your gameplay. Again, it's not particularly deep, but it works and it's a big improvement over the original. This time around, we get a wider arsenal of guns, tools and traps to help on the 25-hour journey, and while I never really mastered the new tools or used them effectively all of the time, I'm grateful for the chance. Smart players will excel in The Last of Us 2, while dimwits like me will have to make do with hiding in a corner and taking out the bad guys one by one as they round the corner. A smarter player would plan out their attack, lay explosive trip mines and move from cover to cover. I'm not a total idiot, and I did do that a lot of the time, but more often than not my stealthy approach would turn into a gunfight with opposing factions, or it would result me in spamming the dodge button while the infected tried to give me a little kiss. At least how it was when I played as Ellie. Gameplay differs greatly between the two playable characters, and each of them have their own set of skills that can be learned, and weapons that can be found, used and upgraded. Ellie is definitely the timider of the two, with her skill set and tools reflecting her life of sneaking around and staying unseen. A bow and arrow falls into your hands early on, and it was my main weapon going into every encounter as I tried to keep from alerting too many enemies. Playing as Abby couldn't have felt more different. For one, there's the obvious physical difference between the two women, with Ellie being far leaner and lacking the strength to punch many foes to death. Abby, on the other hand, is built like a brick shithouse and has no problem getting into a round of fisticuffs. And it's all about how they live and their surroundings. Ellie lives in Jackson, a community of survivors that has built itself a nice little town where life is easy and trouble isn't sought after. The people of Jackson have jobs, and some of them go on patrols to clear the infected from the surrounding areas. They're aiming for a peaceful existence. Something even resembling normality. Abby, on the other hand, and her WLF buddies number in the thousands, and they run like a military unit, commanded by an older gent named Isaac, and they're also at war with a local cult, the Scars. Abby's life is far removed from the relative peace of Jackson, and it shows during one of the quiet walkabout moments in the Wolf's base, where we see a fully decked out gym, an armory, a shooting range, and a great big mess hall where everybody eats their assigned meals. Back in Jackson, Joel's sipping coffee at midnight because he can. At the WLF base, folk are eating burritos because that's what's on the menu that day. Abby's skills focus more on combat and being a killer, and while I despised her character, I actually found playing as her was more my style. I felt encouraged to throw caution and fight like a soldier would, and it was liberating after having spent 12 hours or so with Ellie, constantly scrounging in the dirt for a few bullets at a time. Not that Abby is completely decked out with ammo, but she has better equipment and ammo does seem more plentiful in her run of the game. Stealth is a big part of The Last of Us 2, and the gameplay has changed to fine-tune rather than overhaul what was introduced with Joel and Ellie's first adventure. You can now go prone to crawl through the long grass or sneak under abandoned vehicles, and your character now reacts to getting shot, falling to the ground but never relinquishing control, instead giving you a fighting chance by putting you on your back with the option to take. Stealth is a big part of The Last of Us 2, and the gameplay has changed to fine-tune rather than overhaul what was introduced to the Joel and Ellie's first adventure. You can now go prone to crawl through the long grass or sneak under abandoned vehicles, and your character now reacts to getting shot by falling to the ground but never relinquishing control, instead giving you a fighting chance by putting you on your back with the option to take a few shots while in the relative safety of being on the ground, or to scramble up and find safety elsewhere. It's here where I found the game to be at its most mature, recognising that the player should always have a hand in what's going on, and not prioritising fancy animations, a la Red Dead Redemption 2. Enemies are smarter, but still kind of dumb. They'll follow predetermined paths that can be memorised and exploited. They'll call out to each other, informing comrades to your location, which also acts as a way of telling you, the player, that you've been spotted and that you now need to make some decisions. Do you stay put and try to weather the storm with the few bullets, arrows and throwables you have, or do you slink off into the shadows, wait for the patrols to soften their search, and then take them out one by one? I loved this, and my best moments during the game came from the decisions I was allowed to make, and the lessons I learned from each death. Now, there are parts that seem overly difficult, but with a little bit of patience, observation and planning, I got through the most difficult parts with relative ease, and I felt like a badass doing so too. One aspect of the gameplay that I didn't like, and yes, I've already mentioned it, was the constant shift via flashbacks. Some may love them and find them nice, but for me, they were painfully boring. The main storyline sections of the game all take part in the drab and wet ruins of Seattle, and so the flashbacks provide a nice change of colourful scenery, but they don't really do anything in terms of gameplay. Sometimes they're used for exposition, other times as tutorials, but mostly they're annoying and they take you away from the main story. How can I be expected to care for the story when I'm being dragged back to the past every hour? And I'm not kidding when I say this, there was a moment when I was playing the game and I had genuinely forgotten if I was playing a flashback or not. I'd pause the game late at night, relying on the PS4's pause and resume sleep mode feature, and when I returned the next day, I wasn't quite sure what I was doing or when I was doing it, if it was the past, the future, or the present. Hand-holding is annoying in games, and I have to give Naughty Dog credit for its lack of it in The Last of Us 2, but it's not without issue. Oftentimes I'd wander around an area trying to find where I needed to go next. Most of the time I'd figure it out and be on my way, but on a few occasions I had to rely on the game giving me a hint. and if you're wandering around the same area for too long, the game will give you a gentle nudge to show you what you need to do next or where you need to go. This problem is partly down to the game's graphic design, in that a lot of the environments are very samey. Everything is grey and overgrown, and it does make spotting the little cracks in the walls or the high up windows hard to spot amongst the visually noisy scenes. But still, fair play in not having on-screen markers telling me where to go every 4 seconds. Instead, the game gives vague directions. So Ellie would say, for example, the Ferris wheel. And I'd see the ghostly landmark in the distance and know that I have to move in that general direction. Though I do remember an early part of the game presenting a semi-open world sort of area that came with a map that you have to pull out from your pack to look at, and that's the closest you'll get to a traditional manner of navigation. Okay, so the story is wank, the gameplay is good, and the graphics are obviously very impressive. What can I say that hasn't already been said about a Naughty Dog game? The presentation is really impressive, though the film grain filter was not to my liking, and it did make things look a little bit blurrier than I would have liked, but honestly it's a small complaint that's easily overcome after a few hours of play. Now, the big elephant in the room, the social commentary. I've seen some awful comments on social media directed towards the fact that you play almost exclusively as women, and with one of those women's gender being kind of questionable. Personally, I couldn't give a damn what's in a person's pants, whether it's in a game or real life. I just don't care. I also don't care for what I saw as pushy activism on the game's part. I'm of the view that the more you try to establish people of different gender identities and sexualities as their own communities, removed from what we would refer to as normal, but isn't normal, everything is normal, then you're just driving a wedge between people. And the ambiguity over Abby's gender does more to hinder than to help. I'll admit, the first time I saw Abby in the game, I said out loud, "Oh, that's a transgender," and I was expecting some kind of big reveal. I shouldn't have, but the game did nothing to subvert my expectations. See, Abby is presented in a manner that isn't typical. She's strong, has arms like tree trunks, and she isn't overly feminine. I think that's kind of the point the game was trying to make, that you can have a woman be as strong as a man, and that's absolutely fine. And I suppose for the casual players who pick up the game just out of interest, because you have to remember, not everyone has a finger on the gaming pulse, they may just do it, and see it as a strong woman. But for those of us who do follow the news cycle and are aware of the people who make the game, we know there's a little bit more going on. We know that the studio sees itself as a pioneer of cinematic gaming and a champion of diversity and representation, and that's absolutely fine, fantastic even, to have a major studio looking out at its fan base and saying, what can we do to include more of you? It's to be applauded, truly. But knowing that, it makes the character of Abby a little more complicated, as I go in expecting something more than the casual player would, and then for there not to be the, hey, here's our trans character moment, it kind of makes me feel like a shithead myself for expecting it in the first place. It's a very touchy subject, sure, and I don't think a one-sided conversation, where I'm the speaker and you're the listener, is the best way to discuss it, but I felt like it was only right to give it a go and share my thoughts. It's all part of the game after all, and so I'd be doing a lousy job if I didn't say anything, or I just brushed over it with a vague comment on the representation being good. One thing I can say with absolute conviction though, is that no matter what is in Abby's pants, I still don't like her. Mind you, I wouldn't say that to her face, she would rip me apart, no doubt about it. And that brings us to the end of another review. I really hope that you found this review to be informative, useful, and I hope you enjoyed it. It may not be to your liking, you may have already played The Last of Us 2 and gone, hey, what's this guy talking about? I love the story, and that's fine, that's fantastic. I'm glad you did. I'm glad you got more value out of your game than I did. Everyone has different opinions. This is mine, and I'm just sharing it with you. You don't have to agree, but such things make for good conversation. So, let's all keep playing, keep talking, keep washing your bloody hands, and until next time, bye!